Before we dive in, yes, I'm feeling a bit better after some bronchital circumstances and such, but you know, the Zero series we've been looking at was developed by a little company called Inti Creates, a name you might be familiar with nowadays because they made a bunch of retro-style games over the years, but you wouldn't know it playing this Legacy collection because their logo is nowhere to be found in any of the games. Maybe they're mentioned in the credits? I don't know, I'd check, but I'm far too lazy. Anyway, moving right along. So apparently Mega Man 03 was supposed to be the end of the series, a trilogy of games if you will. That sort of thing. But I guess we needed another game, and you know what, let's be fair, the ending wasn't entirely conclusive seeing as we still has a wars to fight. And so we got Mega Man 04, originally released for the Game Boy Advance in 2005, and for all intents and purposes, 04 is, for the moment at least, the final game in the Mega Man Zero saga, as Capcom would eventually move on to Nintendo's next handheld, the DS, with a new series in Mega Man ZX, which is being saved for much later down the road. Anyway, it's the year 22XX, presumably. Evil human in a conehead jar, Dr. Wild Vile, has taken over Neo Arcadia, the former human sanctuary, and turned it into a shithole, prompting a human caravan led by Neige, that's French for snow much like ciel is French for sky, to escape the hellhole for a place called Area Zero, where there is nature aplenty growing. Area Zero happens to be the crash site of a giant space colony from a century ago because nobody had working lasers, shuttles, or reliable RNG to keep the fucking thing from crashing, but that's another story entirely. Anyway, the bad guy wants to wipe Area Zero off the map, and it's up to Zero to save the day. There's more to the story, but I don't want to give it all away. Just the important bits. Mega Man 04 sees things get considerably scaled back, almost to the point of oversimplification. Zero only retains the Buster Shot and Z-Saber while only gaining one new weapon. The Cyber Elf system has been excised to the point where you're basically tending to one Cyber Elf and feeding it crystals to grow its power. Elemental chips are also a thing of the past. Things are pretty much a lot more straightforward this time around, and maybe that loses something in the mix not having all that extra stuff to play with, but there are some minigames you can unlock if you care for such things. I really don't, so we don't mention them. So as mentioned, Zero only retains two weapons from previous games, the Buster Shot and Z-Saber, both at full proficiency and ready to go. The Shield Boomerang and the blankety-blank-blank rod weapons are nowhere to be found. In their place you have the Zero Knuckle, which has Zero doing his take on the Vulcan testicle pinch. Nobody is going to get that. Zero Knuckle is less of a weapon and more of a utility. Its main use is to grab onto random grunts and steal their weapons to use against other grunts. Some weapons have limited shots while others do not. Some weapons are useful while others are not. Either way, you can only hold on to one weapon at a time, and if you want another one, you'll need to press select to toss your current one and hopefully do some damage with it while you're at it. You also use the knuckle to grab onto switches to manipulate machinery, as well as hang onto some ledges, which is useful for moving platforms. Although unlike in Mega Man X5 and X6, you can't move while hanging onto these ledges, so if you want to move, you have to hop around. Or hopefully you're on a moving platform, and that's kinda lame, but whatever. Sometimes destroying enemies will leave behind parts, and the purpose of parts is to combine them to create equipable chips that grant you unique abilities, mostly chips based on those from the previous game. You'll need to know the recipes to create specific chips, as just tossing together a bunch of parts will result in junk parts being created. Well, that'd be a waste. You can talk to people and they'll give you recipes for some of these chips. But for the most part, you're just better off looking these up online and going from there because that's where you'll find the best chips. Your Cyber Elf system has also been overhauled to the point where you only have one Cyber Elf to tend to, and the only thing you need to do is feed it crystals to make it grow. Growing your Cyber Elf will increase its levels and thus allow you to use more of its powers, but using any level over your max level, which increases as you play through the game, will penalize you in the results screen. Rankings, however, no longer hold the same worth as in previous games, and earning EX moves from bosses is done through a different means of advanced play. And this is tied to 04's main contribution, the weather control system, where you can manipulate the weather in the 8 main stages between 2 settings, which varies depending on the level. One level can have snow blocking a passage, but a change in weather can clear away said snow. One level might have clear skies, but a change in weather could add strong winds. One level has a heat wave you'll need to cover from, but you could turn this off, and so on and so forth. Icons on the map will clue you in on current weather patterns, so you'll never go into these stages completely blind. Manipulating the weather is essentially a difficulty setting, and you could use this to make a level easier in some way, form, or fashion. But in order to attain a boss's EX move, you'll need to play the level under what the game considers normal weather conditions, which is indicated when the icon is glowing. Otherwise, only your elf max level goes up and nothing else. EX moves are your only elemental attacks aside from the Cyber Elf shots, as the game drops the elemental chips of the previous games altogether. So I said that Mega Man 03 was pretty much the peak of the Zero series. The best that this series had to offer was represented with that one game, and anything that came afterwards would feel like an afterthought. Mega Man 04 pretty much fits that bill, and part of that is for a couple of reasons. Part of it is the scaled back gameplay. With only one Cyber Elf to tend to, that means you're not seeking them out in the wild, giving less incentive to explore the levels beyond a couple sub-tanks and crystal stockpiles to help with the feeding of the elf. There are parts you can collect for your item crafting, but outside of one particular part found in a couple places here and there, parts are obtained mainly by killing enemies, and trying to get parts needed to craft a particular chip will involve a lot of grinding. The weather control gimmick seems like a good idea on paper, and some levels benefit from that sort of thing while others not so much. I feel like this is a concept that wasn't fully realized. Maybe there was more you could do with this that could drastically change levels to merit revisiting them multiple times. But for the most part, the changes are somewhat minimal, and the levels themselves, even with the harder weather setting, aren't particularly troublesome outside of boss encounters, who may have an additional attack, and in this state you can beat them for their EX skill, but that's about it really. And the EX moves are stuff you've seen before, though to be fair, you could say that about the moves in 03, but they were more fun there, and they were not strictly elemental attacks like they are here, and also there were more of them. And finally, the Zero Knuckle. Again, a neat idea on paper, being able to steal enemy weapons and use them yourself, but it's not something I use all that often unless I need to pull a switch on a piece of machinery or something. That felt more like a nuisance having to switch to this thing just so I could pull a switch. Fact is, most of the enemy weapons you swipe aren't all that great in the first place. It's not like Kirby where he can swallow a foe and get a pretty useful attack out of it. Zero's basic buster and saber weapons are more than adequate in most cases, and the knuckle became more of a utility item that I needed to switch to every so often to manipulate some machinery. Again, maybe you could have done more with this knuckle item, but they didn't, so it is what it is. Now, the rest of the bits and bobs? Control is as tight as ever, nothing changes on that front, and thus no complaints about that. The core gameplay stuff, the platforming, the action bits, that sort of thing, that's still pretty much top-notch, and the levels themselves are still pretty fun with some tough spots, but nothing too overly difficult, I find. Despite some of my underwhelmed misgivings, 04 is still a pretty damn good game, and I had a good time with it. Almost as good as any traditional style Mega Man game. Nothing wrong with that. That formula might feel a bit stale at times, but when done well, it does work. And the storyline that plays out, once again, very compelling stuff, and I was actually intrigued by it. And I don't say that often about the narrative in most Mega Man games, so that's worth something in my book. Mega Man 04 looks about as good as previous games in the series. Try to act surprised here, but the graphics on a whole are pretty good. The sprite quality is superb, the animation is smooth, the various level scenery is vibrant, varied, and visually appealing. Honestly, by this point, there isn't a whole lot to say about the visual aspect. If you're playing this whole series through, you know what to expect, and 04 doesn't deviate from what came before art-wise. Well, okay, the mugshots have different facial expressions now, but that's about it. It's nothing we haven't seen before in this series, but again, if something ain't broke, just fucking keep going and be done with it. On the sound department, 04 has some good sound. Zero has a couple new voice bites for attacks, the voice clips sound crisper, though to be fair, I'm playing this off the Legacy collection, so it's entirely possible that sound on the GBA original might be a bit crunchier if that makes any sense. But even the Zero collection on the DS had some pristine sound done, so... But one thing I could comment on, 04 has some good tunes here, some really good tunes. Almost, but not quite on par with the tunes in 03, but some good stuff here nonetheless. If Mega Man 03 is the peak of the Mega Man 0 series, then Mega Man 04 is the sub-peak. Not quite up there, but still close enough. Yes, the simplified aspects of the game does hinder it a bit, and the new ideas implemented don't feel fully realized, but the base gameplay is still top-tier action platforming that is exceptionally executed, the presentation and audio is still pretty solid, and most of all, it's still a damn fun game to play. For what it's worth, 04 might not have surpassed 03 in excellence, but it's another worthy entry in the overall series and a more than satisfactory conclusion to the Mega Man 0 series, and for all intents and purposes, this was the final chapter of that series. They weren't gonna make another one, until they do make another one, because fuck, why wouldn't they, even 20 years after the fact. All in all, I actually enjoyed this visitation through the Mega Man 0 series, far more than I was expecting. And playing these games made me realize what I had missed back in the day simply because that first game just soured me on the rest of the series. Maybe if I had played one of the sequels back then, I probably would have stuck around for the ride, but what's done is done, and maybe someday we might visit the follow-up ZX series, but that's for, again, much later down the road. In the interim, we've got some other fish to fry. I don't know what that fish is, but we're gonna fry it soon enough, I guess, I suppose. I'm going to bed. Good night.